Hello, my name is Didac Llorens Cubedo, and I am a member of the course team of the course Comentario de textos literarios en lengua inglesa. Today we're going to be looking at elements of fiction. You have already had a couple of video classes on elements of poetry, and some of the things you have learned can also be applied to the study of fiction, that is, to the study of novels and short stories. And in the same way, some of the things we'll be looking at today are also useful for the study of poetry. For instance, if you're looking at a narrative poem. So let's begin with a basic distinction between story and text. So what is the story? Here is a brief definition of story: the events that are supposed to have happened, as opposed to text or discourse. It can also be called discourse, although I will be using the word text so as not to create confusion with the term discourse as used by Foucault. So as opposed to story, the text is the telling of these events, the presentation of the story to readers. The text may involve a certain degree of manipulation on the part of the narrator, or the author if you like, such as the altering of the time sequence, the choice of a perspective from which to tell the story, etc. That has to do with the text and not with the story. For instance, if we take Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which you are more or less familiar with, the story could be summarized as follows. Marlowe is employed by a colonialist company, travels to Congo, where he is expected to find Kurtz, another ivory dealer who has retreated to the jungle and is idolized by the natives. Marlowe eventually meets Kurtz, and the experience of having met him will affect him deeply. So that is essentially the story, a summary of the story. On the other hand, if we wished to describe the text, we would be looking at other things. We would need to mention that there is a frame narration at the beginning of the novella, that most of the story is told in the first person, that the events are chronologically presented, and so on. We will be looking at most of these things in detail. So we have story, text, and another basic term, and that is plot. When we use the term plot, we bring into relation the story and the text. Plot can be defined as the events or situations a story is made up of, and the way they are organized in the text. So the events, the story on the one hand, and on the other hand, the way they are organized, arranged, presented to the reader. Plot would be, in Spanish, trama or argumento, but please don't use the word argument, because as you know, argument is a false friend for us Spanish speakers. An important aspect of a plot is order, which may be chronological when events are presented in a sequence as they are supposed to have happened, or non-chronological. Chronological order in fiction may be broken or altered by the use of flashback and flash forwards, and these are terms that you probably know, not only from the study of literature but from film as well. I will give you a definition of both. Both, as I said, are alterations of chronological order. A flashback is introduced to present the reader with an event or with events that happened earlier in time, that are supposed to have happened earlier in time. And flash forward is the opposite, the alteration of chronological order to present the reader with an event or with events that should appear later in the narrative and which are advanced. You have also the Greek terms for flashback and flash forward, analepsis and prolepsis. Okay, I will now move on to another important aspect of fiction, another important element of fiction, and that is the presentation of characters, characterization. So, literary characters may be defined as illusions of real human beings. And I would like to begin with E.M. Forster's basic distinction between round and flat characters. This is a very simple distinction, but useful. The novelist E.M. Forster distinguished between round and flat characters. Round characters are those who evolve throughout the narration, and on the other hand, flat characters remain the same and can be reduced to a single personality trait. Flat characters can also be called types. For example, Marlowe in Heart of Darkness would clearly be a round character, whereas the agents at the central station, these men whom he calls the pilgrims, could be considered as flat characters. Practically the only thing we know about them is that they are inefficient, so they can be reduced to that personality trait, inefficiency. Let us look at another more detailed method of looking at characters. So characters can be round and flat, but they can also be defined directly or indirectly. So the first possibility is that they are the object of direct definition by the narrator or by another character. I will take examples from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, a novel that many of you will have read or will have to read in the future. And for instance, in chapter 6 of Pride and Prejudice, we learn that Jane Bennet, Elizabeth Bennet's older sister, unites great strength of feeling, a composure of temper, and a uniform cheerfulness of manner. So we have here the narrator defining Jane's personality. Direct definition. The opposite would be obviously indirect definition, which is implemented in a number of ways. So indirect definition through action, what characters do, and again an example from Pride and Prejudice, when Elizabeth decides to walk to Netherfield. She goes to Netherfield to visit her sister Jane, and she decides to go on foot rather than taking a carriage. So that action from Elizabeth characterizes her as an unconventional young woman who is not too concerned on appearances. Indirect definition through action, through speech, and this is essentially the kind of language used by characters, including idiolectal, sociolectal, dialectal features. So here we would be considering the style, how characters talk, turns of phrase, accents, etc. Let us consider the other Bennett sisters. For instance, Mary, the intellectual sister who uses pedantic language, and the other sisters, Lydia and Kitty, who, by contrast, use a language that is childish and frivolous and that is in accordance with their personality. We could also mention an example, bring in an example from Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. In this novel, as you know, Black English vernacular, the variety of English associated with Afro-Americans, is used widely, and it could be considered an aspect of Pauline's characterization when she narrates her own story. A third aspect of indirect definition could be external and physical appearance, including clothing even, if this is relevant. And this may reinforce psychological traits. For example, in Charles Dickens's Hard Times, for instance, Mr. Bounderby, who is a utilitarian, is described as having a very big head and forehead, a very prominent forehead. And also we could think again of Pauline in The Bluest Eye and her lame foot. The last aspect of indirect definition could be analogy. Analogy typically between a character's name and their personality, or between the place where they live and their personality. For example, Daniel Defoe's Moll Flanders, since Moll or Molly was a name used to refer to prostitutes in 18th century England, or Mrs. Havisham in Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, who is a jilted bride and spinster and who lives in a decayed and dilapidated house. In order to complete the analysis of literary characters, you might consider some or all of the following questions. Do we have access to the character's mind, to the character's thoughts? Is the character very similar as a human being? Very similar, meaning believable? Is this character believable as a real person? Does the character represent a concept or an idea? This is true of allegorical characters, who are not so common in modern fiction, but you'll find them in medieval literature very often. Are the characters prototypical of a genre? Think, for instance, of a detective in crime fiction. And finally, what parts of their lives or what aspects of their personality show through more clearly, and what significance does that have? Okay, so we have covered characterization, and we now move on to a very important and interesting element of fiction, and that is point of view. In literary analysis, point of view does not refer to an author's ideology, it has nothing to do with that, but to who tells the story and how the narration is communicated. As you can see here, who narrates and how. That is point of view, narrative point of view. It has nothing to do, as I said, with opinions, the ideology of a narrator or an author. We may distinguish between personal and impersonal narration. In personal narration, there is a presence, the presence of a narrator. There is a person, the narrator, mediating between the events told and the reader who reads about these events. A very simple definition of narrator could be the immediate communicator of the fiction. We may distinguish two types of narrators: internal or external. Internal narrators are essentially characters in the story, and I have highlighted in the story here, because we are talking about the story and not so much the text. So either main characters or secondary characters who are not as involved in the events. So internal narrators are part of the story. External narrators exist only in the text or in the discourse. They are not characters in the story. They are also called, as you can see here, authorial narrators or third-person narrators, for the obvious reason that they talk about other characters using the third person. Both Heart of Darkness and The Bluest Eye combine these two types of narrators. In Heart of Darkness, Marlowe is an internal narrator. He is also a character. But before he begins telling about his journey, there is an external narrator. If you remember, in the opening passages when Marlowe is when we have this description of the Thames, of Marlowe and the sailors, and that would be told by an external narrator. Another example in The Bluest Eye would be Claudia and Pauline, who are internal narrators, but there is also an external narrator who gives us the background of the Breedlove family, for instance. So we have seen personal narrator with the mediation of a narrator. In impersonal narration, there is an attempt to erase the narrator so that the story progresses through dialogue, as in drama or as in cinema. Ernest Hemingway, for example, is famous for making his short stories very impersonal or very dramatic. And also in The Bluest Eye, the narration becomes impersonal at points, as when Mrs. McTeer talks with her friends about Mr. Henry, or also when the two girls, Claudia and Frida, talk to Peccola about her first period. So these scenes advance essentially through dialogue, and there is no intrusion from a narrator. As you can see, impersonal narration is sometimes called camera eye or fly on the wall, to suggest that someone is watching, but they don't intervene, they don't speak. Another concept related to point of view is that of omniscience, which is associated with personal narration, because obviously it would be contradictory with the absence of a narrator. If there is omniscience, it is because there is someone there, because there is a narrator. because the presence of a narrator is more or less obvious. There are several degrees of omniscience, and an omniscient narrator can do some or all of the following: having access to characters' minds, and we say then that the narrator has mental access or inner view. Some omniscient narrators are able to know, to witness, to see things that the characters cannot know, cannot see or witness. For instance, a narrator who knows everything about the character's past, or a narrator who knows what is happening in a different place from the one where the action is happening. Being able to interpret characters' actions and knowing their motives. Judging or criticizing characters. This is again more typical of 19th century fiction, not so much of modern fiction, unless it's done as a form of parody or ironically. And finally, an omniscient narrator could also feel free to comment on aspects not directly related with the narration. So an omniscient narrator could, for instance, comment on the historical or political context. Omniscience can be selective, which means that the narrator has access to a character's thoughts, and the story is filtered through the point of view of this character. Selective omniscience can move from one character to another within the same narration. So the character chosen by the narrator is called the filter character. Henry James, for instance, called it the center of consciousness. As I was saying, this is a character through which we see, through which we perceive what happens. So only one character in selective omniscience, as opposed to all characters in general omniscience. We now move on to speech and thought presentation, which is also linked to point of view in fiction. So characters can express their thoughts in fiction when they speak, obviously, and narrators can have access to their minds. The terms stream of consciousness and interior monologue are used when characters' thoughts are conveyed. So stream of consciousness and interior monologue when there is an attempt to capture, to record what the character is thinking or feeling. Characters' speech can appear in the narration in direct speech, in dialogues, direct speech, or what they say can be reported by the narrator or by another character. So this is essentially the opposition between direct and reported speech. There is another modality which is especially interesting, and that is free indirect speech or free indirect style. A modality of thought presentation in which the character's direct speech and the narrator's indirect report are combined. So direct speech and reported speech are mixed, blended. I will give you an example. For instance, we have here direct speech. The end is near, she thought, or she said. In this case, I decided to use the verb to think to stress that this is thought presentation. So this would be direct speech or direct thought. reported speech, she thought that the end was near, and here you can see that a number of changes have been made. Pronouns, tenses, we no longer have quotation marks. And free indirect speech combines both. The end was near. So in this example of free indirect speech, the last sentence here, we have neither quotation marks, as in direct speech, nor reporting verb, as in reported speech. The sentence has the same structure as in direct speech. The end is near, the end was near. But the tense has changed, as in reported speech, as a narrator would report it. So the effect is that we have this sentence. The effect is that we feel that we are having access to the character's mind through the narrator. You will find examples of this in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. Free indirect speech is characteristic of 20th century fiction. Other relevant concepts are those of narrative and framed narration. A narrative is the receiver of the story told by a narrator who is typically internal. And frame narrative is a narrative in which a narrator communicates with a narratee. So this is very clear if we look at Heart of Darkness. In the opening passages in which Marlowe talks with a group of sailors, that would be the frame narrative. And frame narrative is opposed to framed narrative. So frame narrative versus framed narrative. Marlowe's narration of his journey to Congo would be the framed narrative. And the introduction at the beginning of the novella would be the frame narrative. Another example, the Canterbury Tales, where the pilgrims travel together to Canterbury. That would be the frame narrative. And each of the tales that the pilgrims tell are framed narratives. The sailors in Heart of Darkness are Marlowe's narratees, and the Canterbury Pilgrims are one another's narratees. So each of the Canterbury Pilgrim is a narrator when they tell their tale, and they become narratees when they listen to the tale told by the other pilgrims. And finally, we will consider the question of narrative unreliability. As a rule, readers consider what the narrator tells them true. They tend to trust or rely on the narrator as if they had signed a contract, almost. So when this contract is broken, as it were, we could say that the narrator has become unreliable. So here is a definition of unreliable narrator: one whose version of the events, whose version of the story is suspect, distorted, and is therefore, must be therefore put into question by readers. In other words, in unreliable narration, there is a discrepancy between what the narrator says and what readers can deduce, conclude from the text. Unreliable narrators are typically prejudiced, immature, naive, mentally deranged, self-deluded, obtuse. All these would be typical unreliable narrators. They lie, they fail to understand or interpret events, they cannot be objective, they try to justify themselves. All these are signs that can raise our suspicions as readers and conclude that the narrator is unreliable. And the last element of fiction we'll be looking at is settings. How can settings be defined? So settings refer to both time and place. The time and place when or where the events unfold. So temporal setting and spatial setting. If we want to consider them together, we can talk about spatio-temporal setting. It may be useful to examine settings in connection with other narrative elements. So settings may determine the events of a plot and how they unfold. They may reinforce themes and ideas conveyed by the story. They can be associated to characters' feelings, their personalities, and their evolutions. And finally, they can also have a symbolic significance. So if you think of Africa in Heart of Darkness, that would be a very interesting setting to discuss, because it would be related. It would be, you could say something almost on all these aspects if you think of Africa in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Okay, so that's all. We have looked at several elements of fiction, story and discourse, plot and narrative order, characterization, point of view, impersonal, personal narration, internal, external narrators, omniscience, stream of consciousness, interior monologue, free indirect speech, narrative and frame narration, unreliable narrators, and finally settings. So that's the basic terminology to analyze fiction, which you should more or less control. Thank you very much for your attention, and I would simply like to encourage you with your work and your study. Thank you very much.